Thank you all for coming. A crowded room. Good to see. Can you all hear me okay? Good. Can you? Can I turn it up or just I'll speak loud? Okay, I'll just try to speak loud. So I'll start. I don't know if this disclaimer means anything, but every talk I give, I say the views expressed in this paper are mine alone, and not the views of and right now, the Department of State, the Office of the Historian. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Hulver. I'm a historian with the Department of State's Office of the Historian. I specifically lead the oral history team. And I'm going to start with the elephant in the room. Some in the audience are probably wondering what in the world a State Department historian is doing here today, talking about one of the most sacred pieces of Navy history on its 80th anniversary. So in sort of diplomatic terms, let me present my credentials to you a little bit in the first few minutes up front. I was supposed to give this talk 5 years ago on the 75th anniversary of the event. At that time, I was a historian at Naval History and Heritage Command. I served as the expert on Indianapolis on staff there. Months after I agreed to the talk, a pandemic happened. The talk was canceled. I left in NHHC to join the VA's National Cemetery Administration. And then after 4 years with NCA, I had the opportunity to start a senior leader oral history program at the State Department. And standing up that office, reconnected with OSD, and they said, "Hey, you want to do that talk that you were supposed to do 5 years ago?" And so here I am today. I'll admit I'm a little rusty, but I'm glad to be here. So I joined NHHC 2015 as a civilian, straight out of a PhD program where I researched the diplomatic uses of World War I and World War II military cemeteries abroad. I was getting my feet under me at the Navy when two Indianapolis issues kind of converged. One of them was a highly inaccurate Nicolas Cage movie on the ship was coming out. The second, there were different groups of underwater explorers coming to us to see, can you help us find better data to find the ship? The NHAC director, Rear Admiral Sam Cox, retired Rear Admiral, has a lifelong interest in the topic, deep knowledge of the Indianapolis. He wanted one of his historians to revisit the loss, make sure there was a usable history for the Navy, an accurate history, and one that properly commemorated the crew. In the process, I think a side mission of that was see if you could find anything that could help them find the ship. I had work doing commemorative history. I've worked extensively with studying war dead, so I think that's probably the reason I was the historian that got this job. So going into it, I think the expectation on the archival side, probably not going to find much. I mean, this is the most, arguably the most covered World War II naval loss in U.S. naval history. But my base of knowledge on the Indianapolis started and stopped probably where some of yours does, the Quint monologue in Jaws. That's what I knew about the Indianapolis. If I was going to be the professional historian talking to the public about it, I needed to know more than that. So I threw myself into the archives. And I think because I was new to it with fresh eyes, I think that was a benefit. So I immersed myself in the archives and sort of quickly got overwhelmed. But as I started to assess what was there, an oral history done by the Navy during World War II with the ship's captain, Captain McVeigh, sort of became my Rosetta Stone for navigating everything Indianapolis. It's what I used to guide my research. And I'm going to show you today, that Captain McVeigh's words in that oral history are directly responsible for his ship being found 72 years after the fact. So coming full circle, USS Indianapolis, very large part of my world at NHHC, and finding the clue to help locate the ship, probably the highlight of my federal career, peaked early, but a fun and strange relationship to revisit this. I covered all of that. So a lot of what I'm going to cover today is the same as what I would have covered 5 years ago. But as I've established my own oral history program at the State Department, this story comes back to me all the time as a prime example of the power of oral history to writing history. And I'm going to talk a lot about naval oral history today, so I'm going to sneak in a few slides up front to sort of put that Navy World War II oral history program in context for you, give you some familiarity with it. And then after that, I promise I'll pivot into the Indianapolis and addressing some common misconceptions, because there are a lot of misconceptions in the Indianapolis story. It's largely a story that is misunderstood. So I'm going to start by talking some about oral history. And my goal here with this is to show you sort of applied history and work. I'm going to show you how federal history offices are collecting history, and then how we use that history, how the historians use the history that's collected. So Dudley Knox in the center here, he's the first director of what will become the Naval History and Heritage Command. He's an accomplished naval officer and a historian. He was on Admiral Sims's staff in World War I in Europe. The Office of Naval Records and Library that he runs is formed in part to record the history of that war. The quote I have on the right there is from Dudley Knox. I love using that quote. I think it really applies across not just the Navy, but all of the government. And it's a quote that I use all the time when I'm trying to express the value of a history office to leadership. It's also worth noting Knox is extremely well connected, kind of the who's who of World War II. He knows Roosevelt and King. He knows the players. Organizationally, his office breakdown is on the left. What I want you to focus there on is Op 16E2. That was the workhorse of this office during World War II. They were the ones that were out actively collecting history, preserving history, so collecting, indexing, and archiving. And that's the branch I'm going to talk about here today. So all this collecting, preserving of history, what types of things were they doing? And the answer is a lot. I mean, they were doing a lot of work during World War II. Everything you see on this slide is what they're doing. Anyone in this room who's done any type of World War II naval history, you've used all of these. I would stress that everything I talk about in the Indianapolis today, this is the foundation of that work. I think very simply, without the work of Op 16E2, there would not be good naval history, U.S. naval history of World War II. And of everything you see here, probably the one you're most unfamiliar with is that sound recording on the bottom. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Because as a federal oral historian, that's critical to my work and the history I like to present. So who created this sound recording branch and why? Captain Percy Talmadge Wright is the father of the Navy's oral history program. Would he know that? I don't think he would. I don't think he would call himself that. Was he a historian? No, he definitely was not a historian. He was a Naval Academy grad, a submariner. He was the skipper of a sub in a war zone during World War I, earned the Navy Cross. In the interwar, he was a navigator on the battleship West Virginia. And then he became the CEO of the submarine Canopus. He died of a heart attack, or didn't die of a heart attack. He had a heart attack in 1931 and was medically discharged from the Navy. He lived here in Arlington, very, very active in the war preparedness movement after his time in the service. When war broke out, he really wanted to serve. He fought for a medical exemption. He was granted one, but he had to serve stateside, and they assigned him to Dudley Knox's history team. So he showed up, he reported to Knox. He had no history background, and I'm paraphrasing all this, but he explains it in an oral history. Knox essentially said, take 2 weeks, learn our office, figure out what it does, and come back and tell me what you're going to do. So he does that. He comes back. First thing he says is, history is boring. I've never liked history. Good start. But the only thing about history I like, as a kid, I loved listening to Civil War vets tell their stories. That was great. There's new sound recording equipment. Let me get some sound recording equipment and some uniformed personnel, and let's record this generation's war stories. I'll lead it. And Knox said, okay, go ahead. Gave him the green light. So what are his goals? I mean, he's extremely ambitious. They're up here on the slide. He wanted to, his quote, get history hot off the griddle. This plan required a lot of people, a lot of machines. He's very aggressive. He wants to send them out to the front lines. He does with some of his early teams. They're with the Marines and putting down their sound recording equipment and picking up rifles to stay alive. So a very aggressive plan. The type of people he's looking to get on these teams, so sort of, personnel is a hot commodity in World War II. So to make sure he can get the people, I'm not categorizing them as this, but he called them, he wanted brainy cripples and pooed out fellas who could stand the gaff and know something about history. So those are the people he's looking for. The equipment he's looking for is also custom made. You had to supply your own aluminum. Somehow he gets the people, he gets the equipment. Then he has to prove the concept. He starts by recording Joint Chiefs meetings, and it works pretty well. But then he hits a roadblock when he starts trying to do all the other stuff. So he hits a wall shortly after starting, and the billets is where he gets himself in trouble. There are a lot of personnel requests going out to the CNO, and Vice CNO Frederick Horn is responsible for logistics in the war. He gets wind of what's going on in this history office, and he starts pulling the string, and he's really mortified when he figures out what they're doing. These are paraphrasing his concerns, but he's telling them, you're asking to go on our ships in a combat zone. They're going to be in the way. What if your recordings fall in the hands of the enemy? This is a huge security risk. What if anybody outside the Navy hears them? PR disaster. What if an enlisted man hears them? They're going to start questioning their leadership. And then he adds to this, I don't like history. This is a repeating theme. He tells him, if Abraham Lincoln was outside my office right now giving a speech, I wouldn't go listen to him. So not sympathetic ears. So that kind of puts his plan on hold. The personnel that he acquired, they're chopped up and sent out as command historians. But Wright has a plan B. If he has a DC team and a Pearl Harbor team, they could get history not hot off the griddle, but warm off the griddle. Start getting people after their combat tours. He can do the DC part on his own. The Pearl Harbor part, that takes some creative thinking. He goes around the CNO's office and gets a meeting with Pacific Fleet Commander Nimitz's chief of staff at the time, Raymond Spruance. He was in DC. Wright gets a meeting with him, shows him his equipment, pitches his plan. Spruance likes it, goes back to Pearl Harbor, tells Nimitz about it. Nimitz buys in and says, yeah, send one of those teams to my HQ, and then we'll send one out to Guadalcanal and see what they can do. And I promise it comes back to Indianapolis. So the legacy of all of this, the Guadalcanal team failed. That's a great oral history in itself of the guy out trying to do these. All of his recordings were destroyed, but it's a good story I won't go into. But the DC and Pearl Harbor teams thrived. I mean, they did over 600 interviews, and they're amazing resources. The transcriptions are at the National Archives, and you can get them on Fold 3 as well. But I'm going to use Indianapolis as an example today of the value of this source. And as an oral history program leader, I look to this program all the time for inspiration. What you see here on the right, that's the cover page, the transcript with Indianapolis Captain Charles McVeigh. It's done a little over a month after the sinking of his ship. And I'll point out, and I'll come back to this in the next slide, but it says in his abstract, if you can read it, that he did a stint with this office, and he did. He worked for Dudley Knox for a period at the ONRL. Okay. So here is Indianapolis skipper Charles Butler McVeigh III, including the photo from his personnel file. He's the son of four-star Admiral Charles McVeigh Jr., commander of the Asiatic Fleet. I'm not going to go into a detailed history of detailed bio here. My takeaway for Captain McVeigh, he's an accomplished naval officer with an excellent record. Everything you read about him describes him as the epitome of an officer and a gentleman. Sees combat in World War II, decorated for valor. I've listed some of his notable DC assignments here. As I mentioned, he worked directly for Dudley Knox for a time, also a senior Navy aide for the FDR White House for a year. The last point there, he took his own life in 1968, and I'm going to go into this in my final slide some, give you a look into his mind using his own words. But it's not for me to say what led him to take this fateful action. As a historian, I can tell you the facts. He lost 879 sailors under his command, and families hated him for that, and they let him know they hated him for that. And many of his surviving crew loved him, but many sailors let him know they hated him, or his families. He lost his second wife to cancer in 1961, which was devastating, and he lost a grandson shortly after that. So, I mean, a lot of personal, a lot of professional tragedy in his life. So now I'll go through sort of a really quick background of Indianapolis and hop into sort of the misconceptions in the story or new insights to the story. So Indianapolis provided 14 years of commendable service to the U.S. Navy, and I always stress, but overshadowed by her worst 14 minutes. One of two Portland-class heavy cruisers constructed with extra space to serve as flagships, the treaty cruisers. She was commissioned in November 1932, took on the role of sort of FDR's unofficial ship of state. He used her to review the U.S. fleet on the Hudson River. She carried him on his Good Neighbor cruise to South America in 1936. And present for almost the entirety of the Pacific War. They're at Pearl Harbor looking for the carriers after the attack to delivering the atomic bomb components. So really a bookend to the war in the Pacific. I love including the image of her. That's the scoreboard, her scoreboard on her bridge. This is the final refit in Mare Island before her last mission. You could see the scoreboard there in black and white. And it always amazes me that it took 72 years to see this in color on the wreckage. So Captain McVeigh assumed command in November 1944 during a refit, and then he took the ship to the front to be Admiral Spruance's flagship for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And it was at Okinawa where Indianapolis would be put on her fateful trajectory. And just as another aside, I love this photo when I'm working on Indianapolis. It really kind of reminds you of the importance of the ship. This was taken February 3rd, 1945 at Ulithi Atoll. Nimitz was visiting Spruance to talk about the upcoming invasion of Iwo Jima. He had just moved his headquarters to Guam. He could get out to his commanders in 2.5-hour flight. So he stayed on Indianapolis from the 2nd to 4th of February, first time a 5-star flag was broken on the ship. And this was a photo taken the day he convened a meeting of all of his flag admirals. And I think it doesn't get much better than this in showing the importance of this ship to World War II naval history. And Nimitz is in the center, Spruance is to his right. You've got a young Arleigh Burke in the first row. Captain McVeigh is towards your right, kneel down, looking off and sort of looking off to his left. And I'll note that there were some, Nimitz had some fun on this trip. Earlier that day, he wrote to his wife that this morning at 6, I went fishing with Spruance's flag captain McVeigh, who was an avid fisherman. We caught 5 fish. McVeigh got 1 and I got 4. Enough to feed about 30 people. So I kind of wondered, did McVeigh and Nimitz feed their fish offer lunch for that day? This is, I added this in. This is Spruance's sort of assessment of McVeigh. I would just, the end of point 2 and point 3, he talks about McVeigh's skillful handling of his ship and that he would be pleased to have Captain McVeigh command his flagship during future operations. All right, now back to Okinawa. At daybreak on March 31st, 1945, a lone Japanese fighter broke through the clouds and made a vertical dive on the ship's bridge. The 20mm gun crews sprung into action and unloaded their magazines into the plane, hitting the cockpit. That plane went out of control, missed its mark, but clipped the ship, and a bomb was released that went through the all the way through the ship and detonated underneath like a mine. The water and fuel oil quickly flooded numerous compartments. 9 of the crew were killed. They contained the flooding, saved the ship, but it was very badly damaged. And McVeigh, this is important, he talks about this in his oral history. He actually, I think, adds in the word, this was a bloodbath. This was his ship's bloodbath. He felt that it hardened his crew. It impacted how he would react to damage. It impacted how he thought his crew would react to damage in the future. And I think it really awakened him to the type of combat that they were going to be facing as this war progressed in the final stages. So Indy was badly damaged, needed an overhaul in San Francisco, and this put her as the right ship at the right time to deliver the components for the uranium bomb Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima. So on 12 July, McVeigh was informed that his ship will be returning to the forward area 2 months ahead of schedule to make a top secret delivery of top secret cargo. He didn't know what it was, but that it would apparently shorten the war. Army trucks pulled alongside Indianapolis at Hunters Point on 15 July and loaded a large wooden crate into a port hangar and welded a metal canister into Admiral Spruance's, what would be Admiral Spruance's quarters if he was on the ship. And I'll note, anniversaries, they would be 80 years ago today, they would be making their transit with those components now. So a timely talk. The following morning, Indianapolis was en route with its cargo. They set a speed record to Pearl Harbor, quickly offloaded passengers, and arrived at Tinian on 26 July. After that, a short overnight transit to Guam. McVeigh chose routing instructions that would put his ship at Leyte in the early hours of August 1st, where he would rejoin the fleets for training prior to reassuming their role as Spruance's flagship. Indianapolis departed Guam the morning of 28 July. They were traveling from what was considered the backwater of the war, crossing from the Marianas Command into the Philippine Sea Command towards the forward area. Based on intelligence that made available to them, there were minimal risks along the way. Their assigned route, convoy route petty. They inquired about an escort, but there weren't any available, and the risks were deemed minimal. and their transit was uneventful, probably less stressful than the flank speed mission that they had just accomplished. Around 22:30 on July 29th, heavy cloud cover at moonrise led Captain McVeigh to use the discretion given to him by Navy tactical doctrine. He ceased zigzagging and increased the speed of his ship. About 90 minutes later, Japanese submarine I-58 surfaced, and through binoculars, Captain Machitsura Hashimoto spotted an enemy ship approaching, perfectly silhouetted by a small moon. He maneuvered his boat for an attack. He armed 6 Type 95 torpedoes and put 2 of his suicide Kaitan torpedoes on standby. Completely undetected, with his target at a distance of 1,500 meters, he began firing a spread of 6 torpedoes. All were on their way by about 2 minutes after midnight. Around 5 minutes after midnight, Captain McVeigh was thrown out of his bed by a large explosion near frame 7 on the starboard bow. Likely hit the aviation fuel and blew the bow off, ripped the bow off as the ship kept moving. We can see that in the wreckage. Almost simultaneously, a second torpedo hit a little further back near frame 50, near the internal communications room. Hashimoto witnessed flames shooting from the forward turret. He heard additional explosion sounds, and he maneuvered away to make a second attack. McVeigh got to the bridge minutes after the hits. The list was about 3 to 5 degrees. By 10 minutes after midnight, it had increased to 12. He held off issuing the abandoned ship. It seemed similar to what they had faced at Okinawa, but by 15 minutes after midnight, his executive officer reported that they were finished, and the abandoned ship formally went out. With no lights, internal communications, McVeigh started making his way toward the forward radio to make sure that a distress signal was going out. On his way from the navigation to the signal bridge, the list increased to 25. It briefly steadied. By the time he got to the communication platform, it was to 45 degrees, and then quickly after to 90 degrees. So he climbed over the rail of his ship and walked on the shell towards the fantail. About 20 minutes after midnight, the ship plunged by the head. It rolled completely over, assumed an up and down position, and slipped under the sea. Hashimoto saw a flicker of light about 21 after midnight and heard additional explosions, probably as the ship was going down. It continued to move throughout this, the one functioning engine propelling the ship, so it was kind of circling to port while listing severe starboard. Out of a crew of 1,195, 400 probably went down with the ship, around 400. The Marines and the steward's quarters were right above the second, very close to the second torpedo hit. Probably 500 to 600 went into the water piecemeal. They broke up into 7 groups depending on when they went off the ship. Ended up about 10 nautical miles apart when all was said and done. So they went into the water the first minutes of 30 July, and they stayed there until they were accidentally spotted nearly 90 hours later on August 2nd. Only 316 survived, and as not to disparage Quint, but as I'll talk about earlier, the rest were not taken by sharks. We'll talk about that. So, as I stated at the beginning, the work of these World War II naval historians, particularly the oral historians who interviewed McVeigh, was critical to the work I did. This is an image of Captain McVeigh talking to war correspondents shortly after his stay in the hospital in Guam. The photo on the right is the rough transcript of his oral history, which I think these are his some of these I think are his hand edits. I'm going to go through some sort of misconceptions and new things learned from the loss now. I'll start with the most exciting. I mentioned how a secondary mission of mine was to see if there's anything new in the archives that could help find the ship. The exact location of the ship wasn't known because there was never a distress signal was never received. I'll talk about that later too. But the Navy determined the location based on where it should have been, following its routing instructions exactly, which is what Captain McVeigh reported. As you can imagine, that's not exactly precise. The Philippine Sea is large, it's deep. If you're trying to find something, specificity matters. So zooming in on a portion of that page, the second page of Captain McVeigh's oral history, this stood out to me almost immediately. The Sunday that they were sunk, they passed an LST headed towards Leyte, just like they were. Even in my limited time as a naval historian, I knew that this was important because all Navy ships have to keep deck logs and they have to provide coordinates at noon and 8 and take note of notable things that happen in their voyage. So Indianapolis didn't have deck logs. They went down with the ship. This LST, this evidence we have in LST, that would be the next best thing. So my thought is, let's look at the logs of this LST. There have been so many books written on Indianapolis. Surely this is in there. This was in one of them. So I started pouring through the sources, and to my amazement, it wasn't. So how could you figure out what this LST is? There are literally thousands of LSTs in World War II. It's not like you can just go to the National Archives and fill out a pull slip, LST1, LST2. I don't have time to do that. So what do? I did what any great historian would do. I turned to Google and started Googling every iteration of LST in Indianapolis I could, seeing what came up, and I got a promising hit. I will say it did take like 10 pages into a Google search, which is a lot, but I got a hit. And the hit is on a page that everybody would expect great naval history to be located on. A flood shop website in upstate Michigan. So this shop's owner had posted the previous Memorial Day in a blog, reminiscing on his father's World War II service. His dad had always talked about, I was on an LST that passed Indianapolis on our final voyage. He was thankful that his dad's ship didn't meet the same fate. He didn't name the LST. And of course, I didn't know, I doubted that this was true. There are all kinds of people who have family stories, but I have a name, Francis G. Murdoch, so something to work with. The Navy fortunately also keeps muster rolls, and they are easily available online. So a search for that name generated promising results. At the same time Indianapolis was sailing, a seaman first class Francis G. Murdoch was a passenger on LST 779 sailing from Guam to Leyte. So now I had a ship in hand, and he's the very bottom name. I don't know if you could see it on the, might be cut off by the stage, but now I had a ship, so I could go to the National Archives. So on the most exciting archival day of my career, I found my smoking gun. LST 779 did not specifically mention passing Indianapolis, but they described in exact detail the gunnery exercises that Captain McVeigh talked about in his oral history. So with this additional data, I couldn't really do anything with this data. I'm a historian, but I took it to our very competent underwater archaeology team, and they worked their magic and made this usable. And for any of you interested in just random Navy trivia, this is LST 779 landing on Iwo Jima, and the iconic second flag raising in Iwo Jima. They're the ones that provided the flag for that flag raising. So this little LST was found itself at two very important moments in World War II Navy history. They did talk about that in their decalogues specifically. So the noon coordinates of LST 779, her set and drift recording, the timing of that gunnery practice, all indicated that Indianapolis was not exactly routing on track as historically believed, but actually a little further southwest. This wasn't really surprising. A Navy captain of a combatant ship could deviate from track up to 40 miles or 3 hours without having to report. And Captain McVeigh was very intent on arriving to Leyte in a timely fashion. But this new information renewed public and scholarly interest in Indianapolis, helped, I think, spark a surge of explorers eager to find the shipwreck. And the 19 August 2017 press release from Paul Allen's Vulcan Group, who did discover the ship, they said that our shifted search box contributed to Indianapolis' discovery. And thank you to my Paul and Sandy, my former NHHC colleagues, who helped with all. They were the mouthpiece for all of this. Thank you. So yeah, we have our search box was 35 miles southwest of the historic one, and unfortunately X didn't mark the spot, but it was pretty darn close. So yeah, a very proud moment as a historian. So now I'll switch gears into some more of the sort of misconceptions of the story. So the loss of a U.S. warship in itself is a disaster, but compounding all of this was the Navy's failure to realize one of its most recognizable ships was missing. I'd like to use this dispatch from the Cecil J. Doyle. This was the first rescue ship on the scene as a visual for the loss, because I think it clearly shows you that this is not the Navy's proudest moment. You can literally see the gears turning on this. Are you sure it's Indianapolis? She's supposed to be in the Philippines. That's what we're tracking. Was she assigned to a special mission or pulled somewhere else that we don't know about? And you can see them getting a handle on it quickly. I love the upgrading of the classification markings. This is probably top secret. That's just how we do it. um, But the timing of the sinking, unclear directives, Navy personnel with inadequate Navy knowledge, bad communication, inadequate life-saving equipment, and complacency all contribute to this disaster. I think central to the breakdown is Pacific Fleet Directive 10CL45. This was designed to decrease radio traffic and take a burden off port authorities. It explicitly stated that the arrival of U.S. Navy vessels, combatant vessels, did not need to be reported. The authors of this directive did not think that people would interpret it as they did. If I don't have to report arrivals, I don't have to report non-arrivals. Admiral Nimitz's staff testified at the Court of Inquiry that this should have been understood the moral responsibility to advertise changes in ship movements or non-arrivals. After the fact, CNO King commented that the rapid expansion of the Navy during the war placed individuals in very important positions that didn't have adequate Navy knowledge about the absolute need to report non-arrivals. This is some of the explanations. I don't think they're great. Secondly, and I think sort of in a bit of irony, the top secret delivery mission of Indianapolis was completed. The attention that this is going to demand and the upcoming invasion of Japan puts something like a routine transit, I think, somewhat out of focus. The view is on something else. The war's in its final stages. I think in this atmosphere, it's in this atmosphere that Indy just kind of dropped off the face of the earth and no one was taking notice. Another factor in the non-reporting and a contentious part of the story is the inability of the crew, despite their best efforts, to get a distress message off the ship. I mentioned earlier the second torpedo hit in close proximity to the interior communication room. Electrical power, main, and auxiliary were lost. I think the antennas were likely at least damaged, if not grounded. Radioman Joseph Moran, pictured here, he was keying out an SOS in Radio 1, but he didn't think that that was getting out. Crew in Radio 2 felt there was more promise. When they were keying their message, the meter was jumping, so they thought something might be getting out. The Navy investigated this in great detail after the fact and determined that no distress signal ever left the ship due to, they quote, the fortunes of war. Once the survivors were located, SINCPAC inquired with all local commands if anything was heard from Indy during this time period. They all responded in the negative. There have been claims much after the fact of received and ignored SOS messages. These include drunken commanders and Navy officials sweeping into commands and ripping pages out of logbooks at night. I looked into many of those as I could as an NHHC historian, and I didn't find evidence of any of that. And historically, I think you've got to treat all those with skepticism until you have proof. Richard Hulver's view, I think, had a distress message left the ship. I think it's unlikely that only the most incompetent of the Navy were the ones that would have picked it up and ignored it at the time. This was really part of a story that bothered Captain McVeigh. He talks about this in his oral history as well. He was confident in his crew's ability and that they got a message off, but his ultimate conclusion was we must not have because no one received it. He talked with his radioman, Joseph Moran, and he believed him to be a very skilled radioman. And Moran gave his hypothesis for what might have happened. He thought they probably could have only keyed it a few times. From his experience as a radioman on watch, if he would have heard something, you would want to make sure you heard what you thought you heard before you verify it. And the Indianapolis sank so quickly, by the time the radioman could have listened again to confirm there was nothing going out, and he thought that might have been the reason. So I'll now go through just a few more misconceptions. The top secret mission, Indy delivered the components for the atomic bomb. This became public knowledge after the sinking. So then the loss of the ship and the atomic bomb became one. So failure to report the non-arrival was attributed to the top secret delivery. Nobody knew Indianapolis was lost because her mission was so secret, nobody knew where she was. It's very dramatic, but it's completely false. It's just not true. It adds drama. The cargo had been delivered. The mission was complete. She was sunk during that routine transit. The bomb wasn't on board at the time. The crew didn't even know what they had delivered until they were in the hospital recovering. And the bomb was dropped. But once family learned, they linked the dangerous mission with, this is my kid, my son, my husband was put in danger because of this top secret mission. And these photos, I love this photo of Indy. This is July 12th during her refit. So this is the day they discovered that they were going to be doing this mission. And then that's the atomic bomb being loaded onto Enola Gay, and on the right, that's Navy Captain Deke Parsons, who's the weaponeer for the mission. This is a very minor thing, but this pops up in stories as well, that of the Enola Gay mission, that the words "for Indianapolis" were written onto the little boy bomb. I couldn't confirm this zooming into photos, but you could. It's certainly possible. This is the Nagasaki bomb Fat Man, and you could see that Admiral Purnell did write. They were writing on these. You can see his message. Sharks. Have to talk about sharks with Indianapolis. So India has unfortunately become synonymous with sharks, and sharks definitely play a role in the history, but the presence of sharks shouldn't overshadow the ordeal or commendable service of the crew. I think casting Indianapolis as a 4-day feeding frenzy is like the worst historic injustice possible. The majority of men that went into the water died from their wounds sustained and burns from the torpedo attack and drowning. The largest groups were comprised of over 100 men who had no life rafts, no supplies. These groups organized themselves around floater nets and connected their life preservers. Deaths associated with severe dehydration are the most common stories from survivors. Men suffered from hallucinations as their conditions worsened. Some swam off alone to reach mirages. They attacked each other thinking they were Japanese enemies. They succumbed to thirst and drank salt water and quickened to their death. Often their hallucinations were contagious. One man in the largest group reported, there's a common story, they reported the stern of Indianapolis was just below the surface, and he drank down and drank a bunch of milk. And his shipmates lined up and they took turns diving and drinking salt water. Those are the awful stories you read. That's the majority of the stories you read from the survivors. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Lewis Haynes, who's the highest ranking survivor other than Captain McVeigh, pictured there in the wheelchair, he was among the group, the largest group of they're called the swimmers, 200 to 300 of them. They didn't have anything aside from what they went into the water with. He survived, and in an oral history way after the fact, he talked about sharks. The quote's up there. I saw one shark in the entire 110 hours, or he says 110 hours. That's not right, but I did not see a man attacked by a shark. However, the destroyers that picked up bodies afterwards found a large number of those bodies. 56 were all mutilated by fish. Maybe sharks were satisfied with the dead. They didn't have to bite the living, was his assessment. Captain McVeigh, standing with him in the shorts there, he talks about sharks a lot in his oral history too. That stands out to me with his, it's almost humorous the way he talks about them in a way. So he was one of the last off the ship. He ended up in a group with 4 life rafts. I mentioned he was an avid fisherman. They had a fishing kit in their life raft. He was trying to catch fish. And there was a white-tipped shark that followed them around the entire time, kept eating his bait fish, kept chasing away the other fish, scaring the men to death with him. And that was sort of that was his big talk about sharks in his oral history. He was trying to figure out how to tie a knife to an oar and stab it to death, which he couldn't do. Also, the survivor that you see on the screen there, Cozell Smith, that's the only survivor photo where they attribute the wound to a shark attack, his hand there. And Captain McVeigh talks about meeting this, he doesn't mention him by name, but he talks about meeting one of his crew with a shark bite in the hospital. And he jokes to him, you better put some red paint on that while it's healing, because no one's going to believe you're bitten by a shark. So, I mean, it's sort of very different than what we've come to know in the. Can we wait till the end? Sure. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So, if sharks were not responsible for taking the lives of most men in the water, why have they obtained such a prominent place in the Indianapolis history? And I think Lieutenant Haynes probably nails this on the head. The experience and reports of the rescue crews feature sharks very prominently. When the pilot Adrian Marks arrives on the scene of Haynes's group, he sees sharks swimming among them and feeding on remains. That's part of the reason he makes a dangerous sea landing. Nearly all the rescue ships that are picking up remains report that they're badly mutilated by sharks. The rescue ship helm actually has to shoot at sharks with rifles to get them away so they could pull bodies on board for identification. I'm not saying that sharks aren't part of the story. They certainly took the lives of men in the water. We have accounts of that as well. And it has to be noted that I mentioned 7 different groups spread out. They all had different experiences. Um, Water Tender Second Class George Stevens, he wrote in his report to the Navy after the sinking, about what happened. He bluntly stated that out of his group of 17 out of 100 or 150 lived. He attributed deaths to multiple things, but he very bluntly and succinctly states, sharks started bothering us the 3rd day and killed quite a few men. You can see it there in the middle, towards the middle. So sharks, they need to be part of the story. They shouldn't be the focal point of the story. Now I have a few slides of Captain McVeigh, and I will wrap up. So what can we learn from Indianapolis? I think it's a case study that naval officers and Navy leadership should pay close attention to. I mean, McVeigh was placed in a situation where he had to take calculated risks. He was going into what he felt was going to be the most intense combat of the war, with the 1/3 of his crew being brand new to the Navy. The training that they were supposed to receive in the United States was canceled because of their redeployment was pushed up 2 months. He squeezed in all the training he could along the way, but he needed to get his men to the Philippines to get them the training that he felt they needed to rejoin Admiral Spruance. And this is no fault of his, but the reason they ended up in the path of I-58 was, again, training. He wanted to arrive in the pre-dawn hours, best lighting for anti-aircraft practice, so he chose a slower transit. He inevitably, they lost some time zigzagging during daylight. Visibility was poor enough at moonrise the night they were sunk. He felt comfortable picking up speed, probably saving some time. Weather conditions, intelligence made it seem like the risk was low. Visibility improved shortly after. The officers of the deck didn't notify him, and his ship was sunk at fairly close range by an enemy that kept prolonged visual contact. So in hindsight, zigzagging probably prudent. When McVeigh was picked up, this is his testimony to the ship that picked him up. One of the first things he said is they weren't zigzagging. It wouldn't have changed the outcome, though. Hashimoto was brought in to testify against him at his court-martial, which was unheard of. Navy submarine skippers were testifying as well, and they all said it wouldn't have made a difference. Hashimoto, the spread of torpedoes he fought was, you would fire that as if a ship was zigzagging. It wouldn't have made a difference. A captain in the naval service is responsible for the safety of their ship. I mean, this is an absolute. Captain McVeigh understood the scrutiny that was going to come his way. That he survived, and he continued to captain the men in his life raft. That's the only ones he knew that were alive at the time. He never shirked the responsibility of command. The Navy did a court of inquiry into the loss right after it. His direct superior, Spruance and Nimitz, recommended a letter of reprimand be placed in his file, and ended at that. CNO Ernest King received this recommendation, passed it along to SecNav Forrestal, for unknown reasons decided to go forward with a court-martial of McVeigh for the loss of his ship for failure to zigzag. The outcome was basically a foregone conclusion. Once we reached this point, he was found guilty. Immediately, his sentence was remitted in his entirety because of his excellent service record. But his naval career and his reputation was ruined. The situation was handled improperly from a moral, legal, public relations standpoint, and really no good attempt was made to articulate the reasoning for the court-martial, the conviction, or remitting the sentence. The good in all of this, I think Captain McVeigh really advocated for changes, or this led to changes. The Navy addressed many of the contributing factors for that loss of life at sea. Any naval combatant ship with more than 500 crew required an escort at all times. That misinterpreted reporting procedure was fixed. Any ship 5 hours overdue had to be reported. Better movement reports were initiated. McVeigh really advocated for life-saving equipment. He urged the Navy to provide parachute flares and the emergency kits, adopt a life preserver that actually had a pocket that would restore fresh water, dull-colored life rafts. He recommended those be bright yellow. They had wooden water containers that leaked. Make those metal, make them airtight, and that's just to name a few things. This is a very long quote, but I think this is the treatment. The Navy's treatment of McVeigh is another blemish in the story. I think his character should be commended. That's something that always stands out to me when I'm doing Indianapolis work. It's not for us to speculate what ended led him to take his life in 1968. But this is a lengthy quote from his oral history. To me, it's the most moving part of his interview. I'll read it. It was very embarrassing to me, being the old FUD on the ship, to find that there's nobody between me and, well, the doctor's about 31 or 32, but I have no line officer above a reserve lieutenant. I can't account for that in any way except possibly the fact that when I thought I was going to be sucked under with the ship, I tried to swim away. You have rather peculiar thoughts that go through your mind. I thought that, well, it may be embarrassing if I'm the only one left, or at least if I as a captain am left, my ship is gone, but I decided that I would attempt to save myself. I must admit that I had thought that it would be much easier if I go down. I won't have to face what I know is coming after this. But something stronger within me decided that it spurred me to get out of the way, at least to attempt to save myself. And on the raft, of course, I had a great many hours to think of the disaster, and I knew of some of the people that I had lost. I hated to think of having to see their wives, and a great many of them I knew quite well, having been in the States over 2 months just previously. Most of them had been up at Mare Island. I knew there was nothing I could say to them, and I think probably the fact that I enjoyed life, that I thought of many a cocktail hour that you have at home after you have an exhausting day, and you come back and take a bath and relax for a few minutes and get away from the worries of the office. I thought I would certainly like to repeat some of those evenings, and I guess that's what kept a good many people going. They just thought of some of the happiness that had been theirs in life and decided they'd stick it out. I think very moving, very good look into his mind. And I always add, viewing, these are the condolence letters in the National Archives. This is one of 3 folders. I think regardless of the legal issues that he faced, this is punishment enough for anybody. Like, it's a 10-inch stack of letters that he signed from his crew, and he had to live with that for the rest of his life. I think it's a very somber reminder of the burden that he would have carried. And much has been published on Indianapolis. Much more will be, for sure, working on the topic, helping locate the ship's wreck site. Bringing some closure to the survivors and the families of the lost at sea was an incredibly rewarding experience. I'm not a naval historian any longer, but I do hope that my work continues to provide a point of departure for learning from the disaster and helping commemorate the ship and her crew. As an oral historian, I could tell you that Captain McVeigh's story is going to be used as long as I'm out doing things like this. And if there's anyone in the audience in like a leadership position or has interesting stories of service, find your historian and share those. Do an oral history with them, because you don't know how we're going to use, you don't know what we're going to find in that 75 years later. And I've talked about Captain McVeigh a lot, almost an hour at this point. I want you to hear Captain McVeigh. I'm going to give him the final word, so to say. And thank you, Captain Toady, for sharing some audio with me. This is Captain McVeigh. I'm speaking at the in 1960 at the Indianapolis anniversary. I just clipped out about 50 seconds. So this is Captain McVeigh talking. And with that, that is all I have. I welcome questions. I will admit I said I'm a little rusty, but if I don't know it, I will point you to the right people. And we have people in the audience with a lot of Indianapolis knowledge too. I'm fine without questions too.
What are your thoughts on why they would court-martial McVeigh?
I mean, one of the most, I think one of the most common things you see is just that the timing of it. They needed somebody to blame. Like war censorship was over. You couldn't put a lid on this. The war was over. It was in the press, looking for somebody to blame, and that those public relations motivations possibly led them to push forward. I think that's the most plausible explanation.
Great presentation. I saw in there you mentioned he was promoted with a tombstone promotion to Rear Admiral. What's a tombstone promotion? I've never seen that one.
It's just when you in that era, if you had World War II service and you retired as a captain, I think you just automatically you were promoted to a Rear Admiral in your retirement. Every rank? Oh, but he never wanted to be called Admiral. He demanded to be called Captain. This is not it's not a positive thing. It's an administrative thing.
Did Indianapolis deliver both atomic bombs to Guam?
No, so to be safe, they sent one on ship and they sent one via plane. So Indianapolis delivered a little bit. Yeah.
So you mentioned the critical letters coming from the family members who had lost members in the thing. Is that in part of the archive, or how did you get a hold of those letters, or where did those come from?
No, I believe so. He apparently received them like around every holiday season. He just got an onslaught of hate mail coming to him, and those were all destroyed. But there are letters. There are some letters in the archive. And his personnel file, actually, I just revisited this. Actually, I think his personnel file was made available after it wasn't available when I was doing all this. So I was looking at it to prepare this presentation. There's actually a handful of even letters like that in his personnel file of family being angry at him and family being very angry at the Navy for remitting his sentence. So they do appear places. The wife of one of his officers, Casey Moore, she wrote a book about her husband. I think it's called Goodbye Annie Maru, and it talk about a woman that hated Captain McVeigh. That book is a very angry wife blaming Captain McVeigh. So you find them places. But a lot of the survivors, I mean, I think they embraced him as their captain. They invited him to the reunion. It was sort of a divided line between like lost at sea families and survivor families, and I think it's kind of reconverged into like more positive. I think one, Harold Bray there were 6 when I started doing work on this. That was there was a big discrepancy about survivor numbers. Somehow the Navy had reported 316 all along, but over the years that had creeped up to 317, and the survivors started adopting, like there were 317 of us, and it created some tension between the Navy and the survivors about you're not telling the right number. And that was another, after finding the ship, that was my next assignment, was getting this number right, which was very, very, very difficult to do, just scrubbing the numbers. But there was a sailor, Clarence Donner was his name. He sailed with Indianapolis for the bomb delivery, but got off in Pearl Harbor. He received orders that he was officer training school. He left the ship, went home. Ship was sunk. The notification of death went out. His mom got a notification that her son had died, and she wrote back to the Navy. I don't think so. He's with me now. But he became sort of, because he wasn't scrubbed from the muster roll, he became the 317th survivor.
Given that it was wartime, I mean, obviously, and the Japanese sub was allowed to be there, what was the charges that he was court-martialed for?
McVeigh?
Yes.
endangering his crew from failure to zigzag, and then not issuing an abandoned ship in a timely fashion, which that one was thrown out immediately. I mean, that wasn't, yeah, but they basically losing a ship with the zigzagging kind of as the add-on reason. There was no other conclusion that could have been. But they had remitted the sentence immediately. So they put him through all this and then remitted the sentence. But I mean, his career was over.
If you'll forgive me for invoking the movie, I am a Nicolas Cage fan, though. It mentions in there that it implies that the suicide torpedoes on the Japanese submarine were part of the factor of the decision whether or not to zigzag. Is there any truth to that? Is that just Hollywood?
No. Yeah, no. That's just Hollywood. There's a lot of Hollywood. I don't know that I've even ever been able to sit through that whole movie, but it's a lot of. And I remember there's a scene where McVeigh and Hashimoto meet at the court martial and or salute each other. They do something that is absurd. Like yeah. I don't think NHHC was consulted in the making of that film. And I'm happy to, I'll linger after the fact if anyone doesn't want to ask a question now.